Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, H1B RN Visas, are they for real? So we're going to give you an information-packed webinar today. I will be your moderator. I'm Tracy Drake, Manager of Communications and Marketing at Worldwide HealthStaff Solutions, and I am proud to feature today's presenters. They need no introduction, but I'll introduce them nonetheless. We have Mike Hammond, immigration attorney from Corporate Immigration Partners. Great to have you with us, Mike. And Ron Hoppe, founder, CEO, Worldwide HealthStaff Solutions. Just a couple housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded. It will be sent to all registrants within 24 hours via email link. So stay tuned for that. You will get that in your email tomorrow. And we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to today's featured guest.
Hey, Tracy, thanks so much. Mike, great to be together with you again. Appreciate it very much and looking forward to the conversation today, which I think Mike probably covers, if not the most topical issue, it's certainly one of the top two in the international registered nurse community, and that is around H1B visas for registered nurses. So looking forward to diving into that with you here in just a second. Just before we do that, though, if as you're logging on, if you would take a moment and in the chat section of your screen, I see some of you are letting us know that you're online, but if you could also let us know which country you're joining us from today. We always like to see the many different countries that are represented on these types of presentations. Lastly, before we jump in the upper right corner of your chat screen, of your home screen rather, there's a little yellow box. We call it our Post-it note. And if at any time during the presentation today, you want to speak live and in real time with someone on our recruiting team, there's a link there to a live chat, and that chat will actually get you connected to one of our recruiters that is standing by this morning. Mike, I think we got a lot to cover today, so I'm gonna jump right in and just ask you. Maybe give us just a bit of a background on the H1B visa program, generally how it's worked in the past, and just sort of give us a bit of perspective on the program as we start talking about how it might apply for registered nurses.
Okay, sure. So thanks, Ron. First of all, I assume I haven't seen any comments about our attire yet, but you should all know that we're wearing very special shirts for presentations. To demonstrate all the world. Ron's is a little brighter, a little blue. The blue ocean, mine is, teal. But we're all good there. We're happy to be here and talk about H1Bs. It's obviously gotten a lot of attention in this healthcare space. So a little background, the H1B is the most common work visa in the U.S. It's referred to as legally what they call a specialty occupation. Some people refer to it as a professional visa. It is used by a variety of occupations, from doctors and med techs and OTs and PTs in the healthcare space to teachers and engineers and IT professionals, accountants, etc. Basically, any occupation, and we'll talk more about this when we get into it in the context of nurses, any occupation where the standard degree is at least a bachelor's degree, and a bachelor's degree is the norm. So those occupations I just mentioned and ran through, if you're an accountant, for example, you would expect to have at least a bachelor's degree in accounting, maybe even a master's, and you're obviously not going to be an accountant unless you have that level of education. So it's the most common visa type. There is a limit on how many visas are given out per year. It's a statutory limit. It's been set for the same for decades. There's 65,000 and then 20,000 reserved for U.S. masters and grads. So a total of 85,000. There's actually a lottery held each year. for them. And that lottery is held in the spring of every year. Last year, there were 900 some thousand registrations for the 85,000 spots. There's also an exception to the lottery that we're going to get into here in just a little bit, but just a little overview. The occupations that receive the most H1B visas are IT professionals, so software engineers, those types of individuals. H1 visas, the history of H1B visas for RNs is a little unique in that we used to have some specialized visas for RNs. There used to be an H1A program that goes back so long ago that Ron and I are probably the only people on this call old enough to remember them. But that program ended in the late 90s. There was also a specialized H1C program that was very limited that ended in the early 2000s. So the H1B visa was not generally used for RNs. It then got some use in the early 2000s based upon a memo that USCIS released for specialized RNs. And then it kind of went away for probably about 15 years. It was very rarely, if ever, used. There was almost a general feeling that an RN did not qualify for an H1B, that it was not an appropriate visa for RNs. And then there was a change in July of this past year that we'll talk about here in a little bit that kind of re-upped the idea and kind of brought the idea of that there are certain RNs that could qualify. So a little odd use, the history of H1B visas for RNs, a little odd usage, limited, and certainly for a long period of time not used at all.
Okay, very good. Good. Just always good to have the background to help understand where we're at and where we're trying to get to. So very good information there, Mike. So you had mentioned that up until maybe about a year ago, H1B for RNs was not a significant or a meaningful path for RNs, but in more recent times, perhaps that may have changed. So can you just speak to what, if anything, has changed in H1B visa requirements for registered nurses?
Yeah, so in the immigration world, there are two agencies and two sets of regulations that impact visas. There is the Immigration Service, or USCIS, that everyone's familiar with. They're the ones that process your petitions. And then there's also the Department of Labor. And for those of you who are in the EB3 path, you heard about prevailing wages and postings, and all those are Department of Labor regs. Well, in the H1B world, the Department of Labor is also involved. And the Department of Labor has a job library called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, and they have a bunch of other resources that the Department of Labor uses for labor in the U.S., not specific to immigration, but just labor in the U.S. It helps employers with hiring practices, it helps set wages by different employers. It's used in government bidding and government contracting, a variety of things. And there's something within those job classifications called job zones. And this is probably more information than you want to know, but I think some people will find this fairly interesting. Is for years, the registered nurse was assigned what's called a job zone 3. And that meant that the typical education was what they call 2 points, which was an associate's level. Okay. On July 1st, the Department of Labor, without any fanfare, without any announcement, changed the RN designation from Job Zone 3 to Job Zone 4. Job Zone 4 means there's 4 points allowed, or what they call a range of 2 to 4, which means a bachelor's degree can be required or can be used or is common, typical in this occupation. So for Job Zone 4 occupations, the Department of Labor's terminology would be most employers or some employers require a bachelor's degree, but not all do, which very different than Job Zone 3. So as of July 1st, we now have kind of the backing of the Department of Labor. And again, this change had absolutely nothing to do with H1B visas. This was simply a recognition by the Department of Labor that the hiring standard for RNs in the U.S. was shifting from a associates was always the norm to a series where some employers now require a higher hiring standard. So that was the big change that happened on July 1st. That is, to some degree, opened the door for, from a legal perspective, for H1Bs for RNs. And I think what has pushed it a little more is we went through a period of time where for several years we had no retrogression, which meant that, frankly, you could come into the U.S. with an EB3 filing in under a year in most situations. Well, now with retrogression that hit last year, we're looking at people are looking at a range of, say, 18 to 24 months, I think is a fairly common kind of range that people are looking at these days with retrogression. So people are looking and exploring, well, what other options do we have instead of waiting that potentially 18 to 24 months? Because we used to use, 12 months or under, we'd like it to be faster. What else is there? You couple that retrogression with the change of July 1st, and obviously huge continued demand in the U.S. for registered nurses. And I think that's what has brought the H-1B to the forefront.
Okay, all right. Really, really interesting to understand what's going on behind the scenes, because it's not the same old H-1B conversation that we would have had a year or even 2 years ago.
Correct.
All right. So now, Mike, let's kind of get into the meat of the matter. At Worldwide HealthStaff, we receive many inquiries almost on a daily basis, I would say, about, hey, can you get me an H-1B visa? I'm qualified for an H-1B visa. And some of those inquiries aren't quite that forward. It's like, is this for real? Is it really a possibility? So can we maybe dig in a little bit so that our guests today can understand sort of the scope of the qualifications required, not just on the applicant side, but in order for a petition to be successful, what the profile of the employer needs to look like, particularly if we're looking to avoid the annual lottery.
Okay. So on as the first bullet point on this slide says, and this is really critical, both you and the employer must qualify for an H-1B. On your side of the equation, it's pretty simple. You need a BSN. And the vast majority of international RNs that I see come through our office every day have a BSN, a full 4-year BSN that will be recognized by the USCIS, by the Department of Labor, that is equivalent to a US BSN if you were taking credits, et cetera, here in the US. So on the candidate side, we usually have a pretty easy situation. Yes, you qualify. Employer side, much more complex. I have to be able to demonstrate that a BSN is the standard for the employer for that particular job. Now, let's keep in mind that for RNs in the US, all 50 states, you need a license to practice. And in all 50 states, the minimum education requirement is still just an associate's. So meeting the licensure standard does not get us to the H-1B. So an employer, there are also many hospitals here in the US that do not qualify to sponsor you for an H-1B because their standard for their hospital is still an associate. They're perfectly fine with associates. Now, it gets a little more complicated than that because not every RN is the same in every hospital. You have certain specialty units. ICU, OR, ER, NICU, etc. And some of those specialty units may have a higher hiring practice, higher educational requirement than the rest of the hospital. Maybe there's a distinction between what makes up the profile of NICU nurses versus what makes up a profile of med-surg nurses at that particular hospital. You also have certain hospitals that would refer to themselves as magnet hospitals who might have a hiring standard across the board. So unlike with candidates where we can very easily tell, yes, you have a BSN, you meet that primary criteria. On the employer side, it's much, much more complicated. And we have to look at the specific unit, at the specific hiring practices. Now, one other thing to add to further complicate things, but in a positive way, when we say BSN, we all think education, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind. I went to school for 4 years. I got a BSN. I'm good. There is also, and that's true on the candidate side most of the time, there's also this concept of what's called equivalency, and that is an associate's degree with 6 years of experience meets this USCIS definition of equivalent to a BSN. So when we're exploring the unit and saying, hey, let's look at your NICU unit or any other special unit, what's the profile of RNs in that unit? We're looking not only at, are they BSN hires coming in, or maybe they have a requirement that you have to obtain a BSN with a certain period of time, or maybe they only put more experienced RNs in that unit. So maybe the unit is made up of everybody who has at least 5, 6, 7+ years of experience. And so therefore the unit can honestly say you either need a BSN or equivalent to work in this unit. And either one can be recognized by the USCIS as meeting that bachelor's standard. But that's the side of the coin where we generally have our issue. It's not on the candidate side, it's the employer side. Okay. To back up just for a second, big picture, think about it this way. Think of every RN, regardless of your specialty, if you've got the right education, associates or a BSN, and you've passed NCLEX, you can go under the EB3 route, okay? But to get under the H1B route, not only do I need your education to be, but I also need the hospital's requirements to be a BSN. So every RN can be an EB3. Not every RN position can be an H1B.
Yeah, I think that's really a super important point, and one that I think a lot of candidates aren't aware of. So really important that we focus in on that. So just to recap, Mike, when we talk about bachelor's degree and associate's degree, if I have an associate's degree, just recap for us, how many years of experience together with my associate's degree would get me BSN equivalence?
6. The USCIS uses a formula called 3 for 1. 3 years of experience makes up 1 year missing year of education. So to go from associates to a bachelor's, you need to cover 2 years of education. So I need 6 years of experience.
Yeah, very good. And just one thing that I'll comment on before we move on is, you know, the H1B visa, and we'll talk about this in a minute, Mike, but the H1B visa, if an application is in alignment with the requirements, the processing can go very quickly, and a candidate can get an H1B visa, have an H1B visa issued to them quite quickly. So I think from a candidate perspective, if you are serious in pursuing H1B opportunities, it would also be very important, of course, that you're an NCLEX passer. That goes almost without saying. But you also need to have your visa screen certificate in hand because of just how fast this process can go and visa screen being required. So from our perspective, Mike, when we're screening applicants for H1B positions, obviously NCLEX passer, but we're also looking for candidates with visa screen. So if this is a path that you're looking seriously to pursue, probably one of the first things that you need to do if you're otherwise qualified is to make sure you have a currently valid visa screen certificate in hand. Any thoughts on that, Mike?
No, that's absolutely the case, because you need the visa screen before the visa can be issued. And the timing from an approval to visa issuance for an H1B, it's not impacted by retrogression. It's simply impacted by the time to get an appointment at the consulate. And in most consulates, we're talking, under 30 days, under 60 completely. And so you need the visa screen in hand. Most employers are not willing to file an H1B for you unless you have a visa screen in hand.
Yeah, really important. Mike, I think the candidate side of the requirements and qualifications is readily understandable. But I think just sticking with the employer side of the equation just a little longer, I think everybody's aware, or most people are aware of the H1B lottery. Some people might be familiar with the term cap exempt. I know you spoke, to the issue of the job requirements and the employer's hiring practice. But can you maybe take a moment and just talk about the implication of the corporate structure of that employer in terms of whether they are a for-profit entity or whether they have not-for-profit status?
Sure. Now, before I do that, I saw one of the questions. I think it was a good question. I should clarify. The visa screen that Ron and I both mentioned is the same visa screen for EB3 and H1B. There's not a separate visa screen. So if you have a visa screen that you obtained as part of your anticipation of going with EB3, that is the exact same visa screen. So sorry that I didn't mention that. Okay, so employer requirements. This is really a huge issue. We talked just a little bit about hiring practices. We'll talk more about that in a second. But a big issue is, can I file as an employer? Can I file today for an H1B, or do I have to wait until the lottery? So to file today, you have to be what's called a cap-exempt employer. Cap-exempt employers are nonprofits affiliated with a university. Nonprofit alone is not sufficient. It has to be nonprofit affiliated with a university. Now, obviously, a lot of nonprofit hospitals have affiliation agreements with universities. For example, nursing schools here in the U.S. will often do clinicals at a local hospital. That hospital will have an affiliation agreement with that university in order to do clinicals at that hospital. But the advantage of being a nonprofit and affiliated with the university is that you're cap exempt, which means you can file year round. Everybody else, so all the for-profit systems in the U.S., of which there are a lot, some of the largest hospital systems in the U.S., matter of fact, the largest hospital system in the U.S. is a for-profit system. So those types of hospitals have to go through the lottery. They generally do not sponsor RNs in the lottery. Now, I'm not saying they can't. I'm just saying as a practical matter, they generally don't. The reason why they generally don't is you put people in the lottery there's a window in February and March. You get chosen in April. Odds last year were under 20% of even being chosen. Then you have a 90-day window to file, and then you can't actually start coming in until October. So for most hospital systems who are looking at the H1B and going, it's new for RNs at least, it's not a guarantee thing that will work for sure. And then you throw on top of it with the lottery of, I have to identify someone in January. They have to have all the requirements met. I'm only having odds of 1 out of 5 of even getting picked. And even then, they're not going to come in until next October. And so generally speaking, we get pretty poor reception from hospitals about putting H1Bs in the lottery. So our primary focus, and most of the employers that we're working with who are trying H1Bs for RNs, are cap exempt, so they're nonprofit affiliated with universities. Now, As far as the job requirements, I mentioned that it's BSN required. We're looking at individual units specifically for that. And that goes back to a slide that Ron had earlier about the importance on your side of having the right experience so that you can be hired in one of those particular units. Again, it's not for everyone. This is a supplemental program. It doesn't take the place of the large number of RNs are going to continue to come in under the EB3 program. But the hiring practices, we do look at each unit. We don't use a standard of 100%. If a hospital says, hey, in this, I've been using NICU as an example, in our NICU unit, 90% of our RNs have either a BSN or more than 6 years of experience, and that's our standard. We're going to file with that. We're going to go that that's not a perfect case, but it's close enough that we can make that argument.
Good, Mike. You touched on an interesting point, and I'd like to just take a minute and highlight it a little further. And that has to do with the fact that there's a degree of uncertainty related to these applications, right? So we can have a perfectly well qualified applicant. We can have a not-for-profit employer that, strongly meets the requirements on the employer's side that you've been speaking to, but yet there's a degree of uncertainty related to these types of applications. Can you maybe just elaborate on that a bit more? Because it really is different, right? A properly filed EB3 petition, 99.9% of the time is being approved, right? It's moving forward. But here, that's not the case. And I think it's important for our guests to hear that there is some uncertainty, and that uncertainty has nothing to do with the recruiter or the attorney or the employer. It's in the process itself.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. And if you were in an environment where you talk about visas all the time, H's and L's and O's and E's and things like that, then there's uncertainty in a lot of visa types. There is not uncertainty in the EB3 process. Unless you mess up your paperwork, it's Ron says 99.9%. I go a little higher than that. You're going to get approved. So we deal in this space with RNs. We deal with the idea that if I go into the process, I'm going to get approved. That's our standard. And we've come to know that. And it's been that way for 25, 30 years. In the H1B context, that is definitely not the case. So there are H1Bs that are denied by the service for varieties of reasons, sometimes political pressure. We went through a period of time under the last presidential administration where H1Bs were highly critical, and they set quotas for the examiners of you need to issue a certain percentage of denials, and occupations like software engineers, electrical engineers, chief financial officers, all kinds of positions that everybody would think needs a degree were being denied under the idea, well, you don't always have to have a degree. So we have this uncertainty built into the visa type. So when we're talking about RNs, and we're talking about, keep in mind, a history of RNs that for the last, let's call it 20 years, or at least 15, pre-July 1st last year, they were not even approved hardly at all, very rarely. So most examiners would see RN and go, this shouldn't have been filed as an H1B, denied, I've got Department of Labor reasons and licensure reasons, et cetera. So now we're trying to convince them of something new. Hey, there's a change that affected July 1st. No licensure change, but a change here, and here's my evidence. So we do not have, the expectation is not 100% approval. And that has to go into the hospital's practice. Maybe not your feeling as a candidate, because from your perspective, the denial of an H1B visa, if you're in the EB3 path, is irrelevant. Doesn't matter. But from the hospital's perspective, it matters a lot, not only from resources, financial, et cetera. So, yeah, very good point, Ron.
Okay, thanks, Mike. All right. Walk us through, Mike. I've kind of, again, just to maybe recap this of what an ideal H1B scenario would look like.
Sure. So, NCLEX passed, visa screen in hand, cap exempt employer, so nonprofit affiliate university, an employer that has a established practice of hiring BSN or equivalent RNs. And one of the things that we will often look at is we will simply go to their job board on their hospital website and look and see what's it say. Do they at least prefer RNs, a BSN? If so, that's at least worth talking. If their website says we're hiring NICU RNs right now and we want you to have an associate's degree and it says that on their website, then that's their standard, which means we're not going to get an H1B approved, or very unlikely with them, because they're presenting to the public in a non-immigration context that an ASN is good enough for us.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. No visa program is perfect. We've talked about that a little bit today. Mike, maybe just take a moment and maybe just reframe some of the things we've talked about today in the context of pros and cons of a potential H1B application for RNs.
Yeah. The pro is obviously speed. So if you have an ideal scenario and your hospital meets the standard, so we've got the perfect situation. Today is January 10th, okay? I can reasonably tell a hospital that I can have you filed in 2 weeks, approved in 2 more weeks, and you can have a visa in 30 days after that, which means you could be working here in the U.S. in March. That's fast. So that's the big pro. The visa itself can be extended for 6 years, but in reality can be indefinite.
Right.
Because of the green card processing. So the big pro is just speed. That's the big pro.
Okay.
Get here to the U.S. fast, which again is both a pro for you as a candidate, but also a pro for the hospital. They can put you on shift in March, etc. Now, the cons. I think the biggest con is for your spouses, for those who have spouses. So spouses can come into the U.S. on an H4, which is a dependent visa, allows them to come in with you, be here with you. Kids can enroll in school. Spouse can even go to school if they want, but the spouse cannot work. The H4 visa does not have work status with it. At least 12 months, and that's probably being optimistic. I would probably say it's closer to 18 months.
Okay.
Your spouse would be able to work. And for some spouses, not a big deal. Maybe you've got small children, the spouse stays home anyway, take care of the kids. Maybe you don't have a spouse. You've been one of those people that made wise decisions your whole life. No spouse yet. And so it doesn't matter to you. But for those who do have a spouse and count on 2 incomes, or your spouse just wants to work because that's who they are and that's what they want to do, that's a big factor. And then the second one listed here is the H1 is a non-immigrant status. So you do ultimately still need to go through the green card program. You would still go through the EB3 program. It would look different than the EB3 program you're going through now or might go through if you're overseas, because you would be in the U.S. So you would be going through something called adjustment here in the U.S. But the filing is also different because you're coming in as a specialty RN. You're not coming in as a registered nurse under the hospital's blanket EB3 program. You're coming in as a neuro unit. You're coming in and under the NICU unit. You have a BSN requirement where their standard EB3 program doesn't. So you're going to have that whole process of a prevailing wage determination. And then you're going to have a process after that before you get your I-140 approved. Then you still have to become current under the priority date chart and then do an adjustment. So you still have to do adjustment. So if you're asking the question, what's my fastest route to come to the U.S. and work, H1 or EB3, it's going to be H1. If you're saying, what's my fastest route to getting a green card, H1 and then adjustment, or EB3 from overseas, it's going to be EB3 from overseas every day of the year.
Okay, terrific. Really great information to give applicants really the whole picture on H1B. Medical laboratory technologists, Mike, I think you see as well, are in great demand. And H1B is commonly used for that occupational group. Just maybe briefly share with our guests, because I'm sure some of them will be MLTs, just on how H1 works for them.
Yeah, so again, the first thing we would look at is who's your hiring employer. Are they going to need to put you through the lottery? And a lot of hospitals will put med techs through the lottery. There's no uncertainty, or at least limited uncertainty, in getting a med tech approved. Matter of fact, I would say no uncertainty in getting a med tech approved for an H1B. So if you need to go through the lottery, you need to get on board now because people are going to start putting people in the lottery. Again, the registration is going to open up at the end of February, early March. If you're not going through the lottery and your hospital is not a subject to the cap, they're cap exempt, like we mentioned, nonprofit affiliate with university, and they can file year round for you. You're going to want to, again, have, if the state has a licensure program, I think there's 12 states that have licensure requirements for med techs. You need a license, or at least have met all the qualification standards. ASCP, AMT, depending on what's needed by the hospital. Already have your degree, a visa screen. Visa screen in hand is probably not quite as important for med techs, but you obviously have to have it. You don't have to have it to file the H1B, but you have to have it before the visa is issued. So you're going to want to be pretty far along in that process as well, but pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward. Good. All right. So this is another question, Mike, that comes through a lot, and I see this pop up in various social media forums. And that is, what if I have a pending EB3 petition? So if a nurse has a pending EB3 petition, where does that leave them in terms of H1B being an option for them?
Yeah, I like the first bullet point answer. It's a "Don't worry, be happy." I think that's isn't that a song? Isn't that an old Sonny and Cher song, maybe?
It's a song. It's a song for sure. Let's save the singing for another day.
I don't know. I think we should have practiced in advance and brought Tracy back in to sing with us, and it would have sounded great. But the basic line answer is that there is zero conflict between your EB3 petition, the path you're on now, or the path you're going to be on, and an H1B. No conflict whatsoever. So you can be in an EB3 process and file an H1B. Okay, so no conflict. Now, if you get that H1B approved, I just mentioned that when you come in the U.S., you're going to go through a different process. You should be able to retain that earlier priority date, though, if you already have an EB3. So how your case looks from a procedural perspective is going to vary depending on where you're at in the process, but there's absolutely no conflict whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, great. The one thing I'll comment on in this regard is, if you have an EB3 petition with one employer, and maybe that employer is for-profit status or is not willing to do H1B sponsorship, there are legal and ethical and moral implications of having a relationship with an EB3 employer and contemplating, then having a second or a different employer filing an H1B petition. So I would just draw to the attention of all candidates that, that certainly needs to be a serious part of your consideration if you're looking at having an employer sponsor H1B that is different than the employer that sponsored your EB3.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. The don't worry, be happy would apply if you've got the same employer. Different employer raises all kinds of issues. What I would encourage you is not only take a look at your contract, but I would be very wary of if I'm representing a hospital and I see someone, an RN has an EB3 already approved with another hospital, I would be very wary of sponsoring that individual on an H1B for me, because I would probably already start with the assumption that you are unwilling to keep your contract and your word.
Yeah. All right. So with that, we have Mike's contact information here. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out through our office or connect with Mike as well. But I'm glad we've got some time available today. I've seen many questions come through, and I know our colleague Tracy has been tracking those. So Tracy, if you could walk us through our Q&A today, that'd be appreciated.
Absolutely. And thank you both for really going over all those details in the presentation. I'm going to move our images up here just so we can see the link there at the bottom of the screen. And this is a reminder to everyone watching today. If we do not answer your question, please take advantage of our live chat where we do have recruiters that can help you with your one-on-one questions. So let's start jumping into some of these questions that we received. All right, first question. We talked about some of the requirements for the applicants for an H1B visa. And this question is, how many years of experience is required to apply for an H1B?
Well, technically, if you have a BSN, there's no experience required. But generally speaking, and Ron can probably speak to this better than I can, I'm assuming that you're not likely going to be hired by a U.S. hospital in a specialty unit as a new grad.
Yeah, that's correct, Mike. I think realistically, a candidate would have to have 2 years for H1B, 2 years of experience, current and ongoing, in the clinical area in which they may be hired.
Thank you. We talked about one of the earlier slides mentioned India and China is eligible for an H1B. So that's different from an EB3. So the question is, do you recruit from India?
The short answer is yes, that's possible. Mike, maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on EB3 for India versus H1B for India.
I would put them into two extreme camps. I would say that an EB3 offshore from India is a non-starter, and I'm not aware of any hospital systems today in the U.S. hiring straight India EB3. And H1B, I would say, has zero restrictions whatsoever. The fact that when you get here as an individual, you're going to have a long queue to get your green card doesn't really matter from the immigration perspective. And frankly, from the hospital's perspective. Keep in mind, the reason we have a long queue in the EB3 category is there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of Indians here in the U.S. today working on H1Bs in the long India queue. Whether they're engineers, most software professionals are in that EB3 category, whether it's in engineering or software. So I see no restrictions whatsoever in doing H1Bs from India or China.
Yeah. So Tracy, the answer to the question is recruiting from India and China is wide open. Of course, candidates have to be fully qualified, but we don't have the same restrictions. There's no restrictions on H1B applications for those countries where, where we're dealing with not-for-profit employers, where on the EB3 side, there's a 10-plus year wait time.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Can we bring our dependents on an H1B visa?
So if your spouse also qualifies for their own H1B, sure, they can independently get an H1B and then they'd be able to work. But if you're just talking about can your dependents accompany you while you're on the H-1B, yes, there's an H-4 visa that is applicable to spouses and kids under the age of 21. And that's what people would normally come in.
Excellent. Next question. Hello, is the visa screen with the permanent green card option okay, or would it have to be with the H-1B option?
Yeah, it's the same same visa screen, whether you get it from CGFNS or CILNI. Same visa screen applies for both H-1Bs and green cards.
Yeah. I'll just put a little finer point on that. You need one visa screen certificate. You don't need a separate visa screen certificate for an H-1B application and then a second one for an EB-3 application. One visa screen is all you need.
Good reminder. And how much time does it take to process the H-1B visa you mentioned earlier?
It takes about 2 weeks to file, and there's something called premium processing for H-1s, and 99% of H-1s go through the premium processing program. So that's 15 business days. So another two to 3 weeks.
Okay.
Requests for evidences are common or can be common in H-1B cases. And if so, you have a period of time to respond and then another 2 to 3 weeks to process.
Thanks, Mike. How do I know if my actual employer would be interested in us applying for an H-1B visa?
Well, I think there's a couple ways, right? If you have already accepted an offer with a named employer and they've initiated an EB-3 filing for you, I think you would simply direct that question to the attorney that was handling your case, or to the employer if you're working with them directly, or to the recruitment agency that your employer has contracted to facilitate this process. So there's nothing secret about this, right? Either an employer is not for profit or not, right? Either they have a pattern of hiring BSNs or they don't. So just depending on what the relationship is with the existing employer, it's a very straightforward question to whoever you're working with most closely in the processing of your application. Would you see it the same way, Mike?
Yes, absolutely. I will also say, as a practical matter, that if your I-140 is already approved and that there's going to be some reluctance on the part of hospitals to sponsor you for an H-1B, simply because you're already down the path. Now, if your I-140 just got approved in the last 6 months, they might entertain it. But if you were approved last summer, you have a priority date of early 2023, hospitals are generally going to be reluctant to go down the H-1B path right now, simply because they can view you as, hey, without incurring all this extra expense and without all this extra uncertainty, this person's going to be here on my floor within the next 6 to 9 months with the process I already have.
Right.
So, I'm not saying there wouldn't be exceptions to that, but generally speaking, I think that's the reaction I would get from most of my hospital clients.
Yeah. Very good. Next question. My husband and I are both nurses, and can we both work as nurses in the U.S., even if only one of us applied as an H-1B?
The answer would be no. Whoever came in on the H-4 would not be able to work. So only the one that got the H-1B would work.
The solution there, Tracy, would be for both parties, both spouses, to get their own H-1B petition for both of them to be able to work.
Okay. H-1B for both.
Yep.
Well, we were just talking about I-140s, so this is a good question. Hi, following a signed contract, how long does it take to file an I-140? Thanks, Greta from England.
I would say that, Ron, is it 100% or 99% of your hospital clients already have a PWD and a posting in hand. Fair?
That's the goal, right? That's the goal, and that dramatically impacts the time it takes to file a petition.
Correct. And so it's making that assumption, which we think is fair on this presentation, it's typically less than 30 days to file an I-140.
Okay.
That's correct, but that also requires, right, the cooperation of the applicant or the candidate to ensure that they've provided us with all the requested documentation for themselves and family members.
Right. All documentation filled out correctly.
Can certainly go that fast. And Mike, just kind of as a follow-up comment, as a matter of practice, because prevailing wage determinations now take so long to get, we really focus on not even initiating. Like if we have a new client that doesn't have a PWD, we won't even present those opportunities in the marketplace or start recruiting for that employer until, and certainly not doing interviews, until we're getting much closer to the time that we actually expect the PWD to be in hand.
I think that is certainly wise, because the Department of Labor processing times have over the last year been not only slow, but also inconsistent.
Yeah. Tracy, you got a few more minutes? Any other questions?
Oh, yeah, we've got quite a few. Can I apply to an H1B if already in the U.S. In past NCLEX?
The answer depends upon what status you're in the U.S. So if you're here as a student, the answer generally is yes. If you're here as a visitor, maybe is the right answer. So it depends upon the status you're in the U.S. But the substantive requirements are all the same, whether you're in the U.S. or overseas. It's simply a matter of how the process is done procedurally.
Okay. What is the percentage of one being selected for this program, H1B?
I would say by selected, I don't like the word selected. I'm going to use the word qualify. I would still say the percentage of RN jobs that I see that are meeting the standard, it would be less than 10%.
Good point. Can one apply for two different immigrant visas?
Well, you can legally, but generally speaking, either or both employers are not going to be terribly thrilled if you filed two EB3 I-140s for two different hospitals as soon as they find out that that's what you've done. And you have to disclose that on your filing. You have to indicate if another I-140 has been filed on your behalf because you have competing priority dates and things like that. So I know most of my hospital clients would react very negatively if you have a second I-140 in process. Now, there are reasons where that might happen. You may have a hospital system that has been sold and they are no longer having an international program. The new buyer says, nope, no internationals. And you may have been released from your contract and they said, hey, take your priority date and good wishes to you and we hope you do well. And in that situation, of course, that's perfectly fine. That would be normal. You need a new sponsor. So there are times where a second I-140 is completely appropriate. But just to do two I-140s as a matter of strategy, in the H1B context, people who are going through the lottery often do two sponsors, and I think that is wise from a candidate perspective. But from an I-140 perspective, not so much.
Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Hey, Tracy, just one question I'll throw out to Mike. I've seen it scroll by here a couple times. So, Mike, someone legitimately arrives in the U.S. H1B RN. What does the adjustment process look like for that person once they're here and working?
Yeah, so generally speaking, you're going to have a new prevailing wage required. And so oftentimes hospitals are not going to start that process off of an H1 immediately, but are going to have a certain period of time, maybe 6 months, but maybe they start it. Let's pretend they started immediately. That prevailing wage process is right now, if it's a non-union hospital, running about 6 to 7 months. If it's a union hospital, it's going to be closer to a year. After that prevailing wage comes back, then there's going to be a posting period and a waiting period. And then after that, then your I-140 gets filed. So for most, it's probably going to take about 9 months to get an I-140 filed. And then after that, you can premium your I-140 so you can have a quick I-140 approval, particularly if you have an H4 spouse and you want your H4 spouse to be able to work. Your spouse can apply for an EAD as soon as your I-140 is approved. So you may choose to pay the premium fee to get earlier for your spouse. So now we're talking, I filed an I-140, I did it on a premium. So now we're at about the 11-month mark. Now I file for my spouse. Spouse H4 initial EADs are running about 6 to 9 months. So now we're at about the, 16, 17 month mark before my spouse is able to work. Back to your case, as soon as your priority date becomes current under what's called a date for filing chart, which is not a chart that's used overseas, but it's a part of the visa bulletin, you're then eligible to file your 485. And then the I-485 processing in the U.S. is ranging significantly variances from 6 months once a priority date's current to 2 years. Often there's a personal interview of you and your family, but not always in the U.S. So quite a bit of variations from the overseas process. But from the time you get in to the time you actually get your green card, if you're not from India or China, 2 to 3 years is probably what I would quote.
Tracy, we have time for one more question, and then we'll start to wrap up so we keep to the promised 60-minute time frame.
Sounds good. I would like to end with this question. So we talked about the H1B versus the EB3, and this question is, what should one do if an H1B visa is denied? What are next steps?
Well, generally speaking, we think of the H1B simply as a path not separate from the EB3. So if you're on an EB3 path, you would simply stay on that EB3 path and the H1 denial would have zero impact. If you were only doing an H1B and that was denied, then you would look and go, well, now I need to go the EB3 route. But it would not have a long-term impact on your immigrant processing whatsoever. It's not like a black mark. It's not viewed as negative. It's simply one of the things that happened. It's simply a non-issue for further processing.
Awesome. Tracy, I'm seeing a lot of questions continuing to come in. I would really strongly encourage everyone that is participating in the webinar today to watch for the email you'll get tomorrow with the recording of this session, because many of the questions that I'm seeing coming in have actually been already spoken to or answered in the course of our presentation. So I don't want to leave anybody kind of hanging with an unanswered question, but we're just not able to get to all of them. If you do take the questions that have been posed here, even in the last few minutes, I think have been pretty well answered by Mike in our presentation today. Just one last thing that I'll share before we wrap up. One of the questions was about NCLEX Test Center opening in Kenya. We're excited that in fact is taking place. I believe that's happening, in fact, sometime in the next 10 days. Worldwide HealthStaff is excited to have a couple of our representatives from here in the U.S. Are traveling to Kenya next week to be a part of that event and that ceremony. As well, we have a client traveling with us who will also be doing some interviews there. So excited to have another NCLEX test center come online. We're excited at the volume of test passers these days, and the more test centers, the better. Mike, in closing, any sort of summary thoughts or key thought that you'd like to leave with our guests today?
No, I think the most important thing to understand is that not every RN position is going to qualify for an H1B, but there are certainly some. And you have to look at it from what is your personal goals? What's your family goals? So the H1B is not the right answer for everyone, but it is certainly the answer for some.
Well, Mike, thanks as always. Really super appreciated. I'm sure that everybody that was on today appreciates the information. And sometimes the things that we talk about or information that's shared is maybe not exactly what a candidate is hoping to hear or looking to hear. But the most important work that we can do, and Mike and ourselves together, is to provide you with accurate and factual information so that you can make well-informed decisions. And that continues to be our commitment every time we present one of these webinar sessions. Mike, thanks as always. Looking forward to catching up with you in a few days. Hey, I love the shirt.
I love yours too. That's good.
We'll be in touch. Tracy, thanks for hosting today. Thank you to everyone who took part of their day today to join us. When you get the recording of this presentation, feel free to share that link with any of your nursing friends or colleagues that you think may benefit from this as well. And you can also check this recording will be up on YouTube in the next couple of days for future reference. Wishing everyone a great day. I hope everybody's new year is off to a great start, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on an upcoming presentation in the very near future. Have a great day.